In a quantitative risk assessment, we consider three primary inputs. Firstly, individual project risks, and they are usually listed in the project's risk register. Secondly, the accuracy of time and cost estimates. They are usually defined in the basis of schedule and basis of estimate information. And thirdly, systemic risks. Now, systemic risks are what I want to talk about in this session and how they are addressed in a quantitative risk assessment. Now, in a QRA, we usually apply a Monte Carlo analysis, and these three inputs then result in a probability distribution for the project. Our research, though, has shown that the impact that systemic risks have on the probability distribution in terms of variance is quite significant, which means there's all the reason in the world to try and contain systemic risks. So looking at three capital projects in the mining industry, we found that in every one of those, in late front-end planning stage, those projects were all more susceptible to systemic risk than they needed to have been. So how to address that? Our recommendation is that a project should consider systemic risk early in front-end planning. And how we do that is by identifying systemic risk mitigation areas. Now, there's not a finite number of them, but there are some prominent ones. For example, the clarity of the project scope, in other words, the maturity of the scope definition, contracting strategies, communication channels, the speed of critical decision making, and there are many more, and they must also obviously always be considered in the context of the project. But what we recommend is that those systemic risk mitigation areas be addressed early on in the project and contained or traded off against one another as much as possible, so that ultimately come end of front-end planning stage, the project is optimally set up from a systemic risk perspective so that the probability distribution in terms of variance is more favorable than otherwise would have been the case, which in turn then assists the decision makers in terms of effective decision making. Now, what do we mean with containing systemic risk mitigation areas? Again, the topics themselves, something like contracting strategy in and of itself is not a risk. It is what is done about it that could lead to risk, or that what is omitted around it that could lead to risk. So, for example, if it is in our power to clearly define contracting strategy so that there is no uncertainty around it at the end of the front-end planning stage, then that as a systemic risk area would have been mitigated.